Delighted you're here. My name's Farr Curlin. I teach in the medical school and in the divinity school and am faculty director of the Arte Initiative, which, together with our colleagues in the Duke program in American Values and Institutions, is sponsoring tonight's event. And we thank the program in American Values and Institutions for joining us to put this on. For those of you who don't know about the Arte Initiative, Arte sponsors lectures, conferences, undergraduate classes on the topics of human purpose, virtue, and vocation, and particularly in relation to the workplace, the public sphere, and the university. Tonight's panel combines some of these themes and is the fourth in a series of talks that Arte has sponsored about the university. And on that topic, please note in your calendars that on April 9th, in this room, at the same time in the afternoon, Adrian Bejan will speak to us about nature, human, and purpose. Or is that humanity and purpose? Humans and purpose. There's an S there. With that, I'd like now to welcome Dean Valerie Ashby, who will introduce our panel. Dean Ashby.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening at Duke University for this important panel discussion. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to welcome Chris Clemens, Dean of the Natural Sciences at UNC Chapel Hill. For those of you who may not know, Chris and I go a little bit far back. We were both chairs when I was chair of chemistry at UNC. He was chair of physics at UNC, and now he has become the Dean of the Natural Sciences, and he dared to come over here during NCAA time to. It's a beautiful thing. So I'm glad to see Chris here tonight to join us for this conversation. This is a really important subject that concerns all who work on college campuses, the practice of civility and tolerance in higher education. We are fortunate to have a wonderful panel of scholars to join us this evening. I'll introduce our two guests. Teresa Bejan, is that right? Yeah. So the other person who's speaking is also Bejan? Is that right? Yes. Did I hear that correct? Okay, I will keep going. There's a collection of Bejans. Okay. So Teresa Bejan is Associate Professor of Political Theory and Fellow of Oriel College at the University of Oxford. She received her PhD from Yale. Dr. Bejan publishes regularly in popular and scholarly venues, bringing historical perspectives to bear on contemporary questions in political theory. Her first book, Mere Civility, which I just ordered on Amazon, Disagreement and the Limits of Toleration, was published in 2017 and has received a great deal of interest in both scholarly and popular publications. The New York Times described it as penetrating and sophisticated. Dr. Bejan is currently at work on a new book on the history of equality before modern egalitarianism. John Bowlin is our second guest, is the Robert Stewart Professor of Philosophy and Christian Ethics at Princeton Theological Seminary. He earned his PhD from Princeton University. His areas of specialization are Christian ethics, moral philosophy, social ethics and criticism, and the history of moral theology. In 2016, he published the book Tolerance Among the Virtues, which has been praised by reviewers as one of the most original and instructive accounts we have on the virtue of tolerance. The panel moderation this evening is by Jed Atkins, our own Associate Professor of Classical Studies at Duke. And I understand there'll be a time for question and answer after Jed has completed his questions with the panel. The title of our panel is Civility and Tolerance as Virtues in the University. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
So I'm really excited to have you both here. As you know, I'm teaching a graduate seminar on toleration, the history of toleration from Rome to the present this semester, and we're represented by some of the graduate students here. And both of you, your works found their way onto the syllabus in quite prominent ways. John, we actually began the very first class by reading the introduction to your book on tolerance among the virtues. and we'll get to the content in a minute, but I will say I've read a lot of academic books in my life, and yours is the very first one that I've read that opens by describing a cockfight. And I suspect it will be the last, and that does get one's attention.
It ends with a cockfight, too.
It ends with a cockfight, yeah. And in the middle we have tolerance. Teresa, one of the quirks of the syllabus, actually, we read your chapter this morning in the toleration class on Roger Williams. And I was tempted to invite you to class, but I already had you yesterday, and I didn't want you to spend your spring break teaching my classes. So I showed restraint. And so you don't have to spend much time reading their works to realize that, they're both very good at taking ideas that are complex, going to the history of thought, going to the history of theology, going to the history of philosophy, and bringing conceptual clarity to really challenging topics. And so that's why I'm excited, and that's why I'm excited for the audience today. Because what I really want to try to do tonight, what I'm really trying to accomplish, is try to bring your careful thinking, down from the guild, and into the messiness of toleration as it's practiced in society, as it's practiced in particular in the university. And so my questions are sort of geared towards that end. And also towards that end, I'll ask you all questions and you can respond for about 40 minutes. And then we'll open it up to the audience for the rest of the time and leave about 45 minutes for questions and answer, because I know there's going to be a lot here that you're going to want to ask questions about. So I'm not going to dominate the time myself. So that's how we'll proceed. And why don't we just actually begin with your books? Okay, I mentioned that that here we go. We have we both have your book. I have library copies. I will get them at some point off Amazon. I promise. I've had them out all semester, so.
So others are buying them.
So others are
Right.
buying them. And could we just begin having you each take a few minutes to just describe your thesis of the book, the main idea of the book and the most important claims. What's the most essential point that you want your readers to take away from your book? And maybe we'll begin, Teresa, with you.
Okay. Well, perhaps I should just say that yes, my book is available on Amazon, and it's also forthcoming in paperback later this year, so you can actually afford it. Well, right. Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me. As the lesser of the Bejans, I am very pleased to speak first. Right, so I often joke about the book. So the book came out in 2017, and the title is Mere Civility. And at the time, everyone was sort of congratulating me on the timeliness of my monograph. And I joked that, well, of course, all timely monographs begin as untimely dissertations. And I think that's true. So the book was based on my dissertation. And when I sort of set out to write my dissertation, I didn't set out to write on civility. I was interested in the history of religious toleration, as you say, and also in the question of education and civic education. And I really got turned on to civility because at that time, which was around 2008, I began to notice that the language of civility was really ubiquitous, and we were getting a lot of declarations of a crisis of civility. For the younger members of the audience, perhaps this is foreign to you. You thought the crisis of civility was invented in 2017. Not the case. And I was struck at the time by the ubiquity of the language, but also by my, let's just put it out there, my sort of contrarian suspicion that talk about civility is pretty much always bullshit in both the vernacular and the technical sense. And for the technical sense, I refer you to the writings of Harry Frankfurt. But in any case, I was really interested in the way that calls for civility often serve to suppress disagreement, stigmatize those who are opponents as uncivil, in that sense of being uncivil as being somehow beyond the pale, which is an interesting expression in and of itself with a long history. And the idea that very often the call for civility poses as a virtue that's supposed to make disagreement tolerable. And yet in practice, very often it seems to make disagreement unlikely, or if not impossible. And I was, so it was that suspicion. And I would, define myself, and still to this day, as a kind of civility skeptic. But I think it's important to understand the book that it was really motivated by this suspicion and this skepticism. Because what I noticed is that the language of civility in this particular sense, because civility is a very old word, it's an old concept, it has a long history. But I think that in the book I argue that civility in the sense of a conversational virtue that's relevant to disagreement in particular emerges in the 16th and 17th centuries in the context of debates about the toleration of religious difference. And so I was interested in that kind of parallel in this kind of conceptual development in the way that civility was invoked in the 17th century and how it's invoked today. And so that was sort of the motivation in the course of then doing my dissertation. And of course, this is what I say to the graduate students present. If you end up at the end of your dissertation thinking what you did when you went in, that's a problem. So of course I concluded that no, civility is indeed a virtue. It's not bullshit. It's actually really essential in tolerant societies. But what's so interesting is that by recovering these debates about civility, the meaning of civility, how it makes disagreement tolerable, and situating them in particular historical contexts and practices of toleration, you could see the way that attempts to cultivate civility as a virtue always are trying to balance between two possibilities. On the one hand, of suppressing disagreement itself or excluding those who differ on the other, right? So we have these kind of poles of suppression and exclusion, and I argue in the book that there is a conception of civility, what I call mere civility, and which I associate with the evangelical theory and practice of a man called Roger Williams. Speaking of the most unlikely things that in the course of my dissertation, I did not set out to write a dissertation that made Roger Williams a kind of poster child for anything, because when I started my dissertation, I had not heard of Roger Williams. But anyway, these schools in North Carolina are terrible. Just joking. Anyway, so this sort of mere civility, which I associate with Williams' kind of evangelical practice, is actually a really appealing way of thinking about what unmurderous coexistence under conditions of prolonged and profound disagreement actually requires. So right, I mean, I'll be saying a lot more and fielding your challenges on what that looks like. So that's the gist.
We'll revisit Williams in a second. I'll get John to answer the same question. I will say Professor Bejan's TED Talk was the first TED Talk I've ever seen that had a warning at the beginning for explicit language. She said, bullshit. That's what got her.
You really can't take me anywhere.
Professor Bowlin, the same question.
So the question is
The thesis of your book, and what do you hope to prove? What do you hope to achieve? What do you hope to approve?
So my book didn't start as a dissertation. It really did start at a cockfight. I did go to a cockfight. I went in thinking that I would tolerate this practice out of solidarity with I was living in Oklahoma at the time. Solidarity with the Native and Latinx communities that held cockfights. There was a petition to ban it. So I went to a cockfight to try to figure it out, to be a citizen. And I went in thinking, okay, I'm going to be in solidarity with these people, and I'm actually going to think that this is a horrible practice. And I left thinking it was horrible. And I had a kind of rabid desire to coerce this practice out of existence. And then I began to doubt myself. I actually then started reading around in the literature, some of it scholarly, some of it popular. What you discover when you read contemporary literature on tolerance and toleration, scholarly and popular, is that everybody hates it. And I mean left, right, and center. Right, so you can go, I mean, in my opening chapter that Jed mentioned, I can list evangelical youth pastors who, there's one, what's the guy's name? The Focus on the Family guy. Dobson. His son, kind of evangelical youth pastor, has written a book called Don't Be Tolerant, or something like that, or Toleration is Stupid. It's for 14-year-old evangelical youth. So that's kind of on the right end of the spectrum, white, evangelical, center of the country. But then you can find intellectual coastal elites like Wendy Brown and others who think that toleration is a bad idea as well. On the right, the worry is about moral collapse, right? We tolerate, if tolerance is a virtue, if it's lifted up as a moral ideal, we're going to tolerate what our grandparents, noble, wise, virtuous, never would. And on the left, the worry is about condescension, right? There are those who tolerate and there are those who are tolerated, and the exchange is across a power gradient. And when you're powerful, you're in a position to tolerate those who are less so. And my own contrarian instinct is if you've got a moral ideal or a virtue that everybody hates, this is something worth paying attention to. You should look at this and try to figure it out. One way to think about the difference between our two books is that concepts that are moral ideals have both histories and definitions. And they all have both. Often moral ideals have really poor definitions, and therefore we have to do the history to kind of figure it out and see if we can find a time and place that can help us get critical purchase on the moral ideal or virtue that we're puzzling about. My book started out that way, and I'm really delighted to meet Jed because he tells me he's writing on the early church. The original version of the book had 4 chapters on the early church. In addition to the chapters that are in it now, I brought it to my editor, and my editor said, well, you're not Peter Brown. You can't have a 600-page book. Yours must be 300 pages. So I cut those chapters, and they've been lying fallow on my desk for a while. So I was trying to do both history and concept. I cut the history part out. And so instead of doing a historical inquiry that will help us get some critical purchase on what the ideal, what the concept, what the virtue amounts to, what I do is it's simply the conceptual work. I try to regiment our contemporary vocabulary of tolerating dissent, enduring difference, and then nesting that in a complicated collection of concepts: coercion, exit, expulsion, indifference, withdrawal, and then try to theorize that principal action, enduring what you despise or dislike, as a virtue. The idea then to regiment our vocabulary of this virtue, hoping then to clear up the confusion about its proper application. You can do this work by doing history, you can do this work by doing the conceptual work. My book is basically a conceptual book. And again, the aim is to make an intervention in a contemporary landscape where conversation about what is right tolerance, what's true tolerance, and what's a semblance, what's a false look-alike, is an ongoing debate. So that was the aim.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'll follow up just a couple of questions that your responses prompted. I'm going to go back to the hero of your book a little bit, Teresa, Roger Williams, because he is an unlikely hero. And he is, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you read Williams along with Locke, and you know, Williams, his account of civility that you bring out nicely, I mean, he believes it encompasses Native Americans, it encompasses Muslims, it encompasses Catholics. Everyone can be tolerated. And of course, Locke doesn't include, for instance, Muslims and Catholics and atheists. So on one hand, Williams is more inclusive than somebody like Locke. But there's one group of troublemakers, it turns out. And I was shocked as a Pennsylvanian to see who these troublemakers were. They're the Quakers. Okay, the Quakers are the troublemakers. What's wrong with the poor Quakers from Roger Williams's perspective?
Jetta, that's an excellent question. Perhaps I should say that in my new book on equality, I am also talking about the Quakers and, you know, sort of centering Quaker theory and practice, whereas in the Civility book, I very much foreground the critique of Quaker in theory and practice. But basically, Roger Williams' concern is that the Quakers turn incivility into a demand of spiritual goodness. So the Quaker, you know, and very often people say, I'm sure many of you in the audience are, who could have any beef with the Quakers? But actually, we have to remember that early Quakerism is not exactly what we think of the Quakers as today. I mean, the early Quakers were disruptive evangelicals in an extreme sense. So they were known, among other things, for interrupting other people's church services by banging pots and pans, going naked for a sign in public. There's the memorable instance where a Quaker man supposedly takes off his pants and prostrates himself on the communion table in an Anglican church. So I mean, and this is all part of a commitment to the idea that what the duty of a Christian is to witness against error, and the rules of civil worship, basically the rules of respectful behavior in society, are effectively a form of blasphemy and a worshiping of the beast. So just to give you my favorite example, and one that's in the center of my work on equality, is the insistence on the use of the first person singular, the second person, the singular you. So they use thee and thou as the singular because you in English is actually the plural. So when we say you, we're vouing each other in French. You know, it's a way of respecting each other to say you. Thee and thou is the familiar term. And the Quakers say, this is an innovation of Catholicism to vou people. And it's a way of worshiping images. It's worshiping idols because you're worshiping images of God. And so, I mean, this sounds cuckoo bananas, right? But basically just mild eccentricity. I think Williams, who's trying to found a tolerant society in the New World on the frontier and trying to make all of these very unlikely candidates for building a new colony work together, this kind of view that incivility is a demand of true religion, it does threaten to overturn the possibility of coexistence. But what I find so fascinating about Williams, and why I sort of emphasize practice as well as theory, it's sort of as a matter of theory for Williams, the Quakers could well be intolerable. As a matter of practice, he tolerates them. And it's that gap. That's why for me, I find Williams much more compelling in the end as a practitioner of tolerance than I do the kind of more beloved and more familiar kind of armchair theorists. And maybe that, I see like there are experts in the audience who can call me, Locke obviously, got in the field occasionally. But I do think basically there's a difference between those who primarily are theorizing toleration and theorizing what the limits of toleration must be, versus those who are actually practicing and determining what's possible in the constitution of a society in practice. So that's why I like Williams.
So just to follow, then would it be? So I'm trying to figure out exactly like the threshold of mere civility, and it's clear that the Quakers didn't meet the threshold. And so is it fair then for Williams to say that sort of the threshold of civility is not reached when you interrupt the other person's right to speak or ability to speak? I mean, is that because you mentioned the banging of the pots and pans, the interrupting of the preacher, the laying down prostrate naked on the communion table? All those kind of disrupt the service and it's going to end speech.
Yeah.
So is that a fair, like does that work? Like trying to draw out a principle to say this is the threshold of mere civility?
I think there are two sort of conditions, and the Quakers test both. So the first condition of mere civility is the willingness to conform to culturally contingent rules of civil worship, right? So just the norms of respectful behavior in the society in which one happens to live. And for Williams, this is basically a kind of injunction to civil hypocrisy. We have to commit to being hypocrites in civil life so as to be sincere in our spiritual life, so as to pursue the good spiritually. So the Quakers violate that, right? But what you've pointed to is the other crucial condition. Mere civility is a commitment to ongoing civil conversation. And the problem with the Quakers is not only their interruptions. I mean, the thing that drives Williams absolutely batty, and you can laugh because it's funny, is the Quakers' habit of falling to silence in the middle to sort of shut down a debate. They sort of all of a sudden, oh, sorry, I'm going to have to fall into silent prayer. And you're like, is it because I was winning? Right? You can see how frustrating that was. So it was those two things, right? So civility is the commitment to ongoing civil conversation and also the commitment to abiding by contingent rules, which we don't endorse because they're reasonable, rational, or fair. We endorse them because they're the rules that are under which we're living. And that I find really fascinating. It's a kind of anti-aspirational tone that going back to the literature, I just found was completely absent from scholarly discussions of civility as a virtue, whether by philosophers, political theorists, or theologians.
Yeah, good, thanks. John, so Teresa has this account of, mere civility, and she contrasts it with this kind of civility that, sort of shuts down dissent. I mean, I forget exactly how she puts it with Hobbes, but it's quite a nice way of putting it. Difference without disagreement. Yeah. Right. And so she wants to. So there's a type of civility that's restrictive, and so she wants this mere civility, it's kind of a threshold type of civility to keep the conversation going. Should we go for mere tolerance? Does that work for tolerance, or tell more about your understanding of tolerance as a virtue?
Yeah, it's not clear to me how the analogy works from mere civility to mere tolerance, and this, in some respects, is a question about how to interpret what Teresa thinks mere civility amounts to. I mean, I take it. See if this is right, Teresa. That you're signaling a civility that some of us might not consider at first blush all that civil. It's boisterous. It's raucous. It's loud. It's banging on pots and pans. And it requires, I take it, a recognition that civility must be compatible with contestation, with disagreement, with correction, with evangelical hope for the reformation of the other person. Is that right?
Yeah, and a recognition of the permanence of disagreement.
Yeah.
As a condition of coexistence.
Yeah, good. And I take it that point, I mean, as a historical point, I have no idea about Roger Williams, but as a kind of contemporary theoretical point, and as an ideal and as a recommendation, I think it's lovely. I think it's exactly right. That this kind of raucous civility is an important aspect of any community that recognizes difference that's going to be entrenched and unavoidable. I also take it that kind of raucous civility, and I take it again, this is a lesson of the Williams example, that raucous civility requires a robust tolerance. A kind of patient endurance that enables the parties to a disagreement to forsake the other options. Correction that yields coercion, not simply verbal correction, but physical. Exit, expulsion, withdrawal. I mean, these are all the other options on the table for a community that's divided by disagreement. The recommendation of mere civility is boisterous disagreement and robust tolerance.
Yeah.
That just seems right to me. But then the question is how the modifier mere works, right? So I think it's going to be robust tolerance and mere civility. They've got to go together, it seems to me.
I think that's right. And it is just to say, I mean, one of the things I loved so much about your book was the recovering of a kind of robust sense of tolerance. I mean, John is absolutely right about the sort of what you call it in the book, the rhetoric against tolerance, in contemporary debate, but also in scholarship, and just sort of recovering the virtue of a willingness to put up was needed to be done, and you do it really brilliantly.
Good. Well, thanks. So we have some students in the audience, and they're going to weigh in at some point with questions in a few minutes. But I want to begin. I want to raise a question that students raise sometimes about this, and I'm going to start with you, John, because your book is actually about justice. I mean, you argue that tolerance is a principle of justice, and of course, some of my students feel a little uncomfortable with tolerance as a virtue because well, doesn't it conflict in some ways with their deeply held aspirations for a just and equitable society? And so if you're forbearing something that you think is wrong, right, and you're letting it, you're letting it be rather than sort of confronting it actively, aren't you somehow complicit in injustice? Sort of forbearing with an idea rather than, let's say, calling it out or taking some kind of action to it. So is this a problem? How does tolerance cope with our aspirations to a just and inequitable society?
Right. No, this is a really important question, and I think this question is at the heart of the contemporary debate about whether tolerance is in fact a virtue. And I take it this is a worry that spans across the political and ecclesial spectrum from left to right. Well, I mean, here's the thing. I don't have much to say in general about this. We shouldn't tolerate what's intolerable. And we should endure what we ought to. Now notice, both of those clauses include justice words. What we ought to and what we ought not. Surely we shouldn't tolerate grave and horrific violations of persons and sacred value. Now that's a pretty abstract sentence. I don't specify what a grave violation of persons or sacred value actually is. Presumably that's one of the things we will dispute about in our communities. We'll need civil discourse to talk about. But once we come to a settled conclusion about what a grave, horrific violation of persons or sacred value amounts to, presumably that's intolerable. And your students are exactly right about that. If we're endorsing tolerance as an ideal such that we endure those violations, then we've got trouble. But already the language I'm using to describe this is morally loaded and referring to the terms of justice. Let me just say one more thing, and then I'll pass the ball. For my students at the seminary, and I suspect for students at a place like Duke, who are worried that tolerating what we dislike or despise compromises our pursuit of justice, I almost want to turn the tables on them and say, look, if you narrate the history of the social justice movements that we tend to endorse, valorize, right? So the abolitionist movement, suffragist movements, labor movements of the early 20th century, civil rights movements, movements of gay and lesbian and queer persons for recognition and dignity. Often these are movements that are built around coalitions of groups and persons, different communities, often congregations. So I teach at a theological seminary where the students are deeply interested in community organizing. I'm looking at my friend Luke Brotherton. And the community organizing groups that I participated in are collections of congregations who have vehement, deeply held disagreements about basic matters. Right? Some of the groups I've been involved with, I'm an old-fashioned mainline sloppy liberal, and my congregation, when we join together with evangelicals or very conservative Catholic congregations who don't ordain women and who don't recognize, at least within their ecclesial practice, the standing of gays and lesbians, people in my church say, why are we in coalition with these people? And the answer is, well, there's stuff we want to get done together, right? And I'm thinking about a particular campaign that we did in New Jersey about payday lending, where the payday lenders were charging 30%, basically usury rates, 30%, and we were trying to pass a law in Trenton to get it down to 10%. But to do that, we had to band together with people whose basic commitments we basically despised. Okay? That work of justice required tolerance, it seems to me. So.
That's good.
Can I speak to that actually? So I do think that this is a point of, I agree with most of this. I mean, sort of basically all of it. But I do think that it touches on a difference between our books, which is that I agree. I come to the conclusion, and I endorse the idea that civility is indeed a virtue. But to endorse civility as a virtue, I think it goes hand in hand with a kind of recognition of the disunity of the virtues. And so to say that civility is a virtue is not to say that it's the same thing or always consistent with justice. I actually think that the demands of justice and civility are very often at odds.
Yeah.
And I think that partly this is just a function of our, I'm an early modernist, so it's all, for me, it's all about the kind of falling apart and dissonance and the division of communities, in the sort of the end of unity. And I think so that I really want to maintain, because I think one of the things that's gone wrong among my ilk in being able to understand things like civility or tolerance is this kind of insistence that surely all good things must go together, and surely justice, respect, civility, democracy, etc. These are all yay words, so they must all go together. And so partly what I'm just saying, well, no, that's not necessarily the case. But to your point about the importance of coalitions, I think that that point can't be emphasized enough. And one of the things that really worries me about the kind of ubiquity now of this concern about complicity is that it sounds and functions so much like concerns about pollution in terms of the early modern sectarians' idealists. The idea is that if you have any kind of intercourse or conversation, of course I mean these in the expansive 17th century sense, with an unbeliever or a sinner, that you yourself will be polluted. And so the overwhelming concern is a concern of purity. And this, I think, I will sort of take a stand and say that the early modern sort of disunity, division approach is apposite here, because basically politics demands that we surrender our hope to purity. If you attempt a politics of purity, the end is very often not justice.
People are going to die.
People are going to die. I mean, it's right. This isn't an exaggeration, and I think that point, especially, I'm a political theorist. The fact that that point seems to be one that political theorists don't really seem to think about all that much seems very worrying to me. This idea that and so some of my friends tease me for being basically an Augustinian, or a kind of Calvinist, which I'm really not. But one of the things I do find attractive about this kind of moment when people are theorizing civility in contrast to spiritual goodness is because I think it captures this sense of the realm of the political or of civil society as being in an important way fallen, which isn't to say that it can't be made better and improved, but that we have to keep very clear that the standards of goodness and the standards of justice come apart, especially if we're committed to living in this thing we call a tolerant society. It may be that we give up that commitment, and when I hear this language of complicity and pollution, of impurity, I begin to worry we've given up the commitment to living in a tolerant society. But that, I think actually this kind of question of, the relationship between these virtues and how we construe justice is really important. Just as a final point, I think also we need to keep an eye on, John is an excellent ethicist, and so uses justice in the sort of full sense. But I, coming again from a different field, I worry that the meaning of justice has become incredibly narrow, and in reducing the sphere of ethical concern, to reducing ethical concern to questions of justice, we mean basically questions of right and corresponding duties to individuals. And I think that it leads to a kind of really lamentable evacuation of our moral and ethical discourse. And so partly what I'm doing in talking about such a sort of fuddy-duddy, old-fashioned virtue as civility is sort of trying to bring that back in to say that, no, this isn't a matter of what I owe you as a moral person. This is something else. And so I do resist this kind of, this say that, that if I'm talking about civility, then it must sort of be compatible with justice in some way, or demanded by justice.
Good. Yeah, thanks. Thanks both for that. Let's move, because I do want to turn it over soon to questions, but I want to get to the campus. So let's talk about free speech on campus. And we have actually a student here who did his undergrad at Middlebury College. And we know that, there was an incident a few years ago at Middlebury where they invited Charles Murray, and there were protests, and, he couldn't continue the talk. And as a result of that, there were responses. And one was, there was a statement that a couple of professors at Princeton drafted that was widely signed. It was Cornell West and Robert George. And they begin this statement by citing John Stuart Mill argument on liberty for toleration. And of course, Mill's argument is that difference needs to be accommodated because false as well as true opinions are necessary for the development of knowledge, which is a good. And they argue that it's a good of the university. So that's how they begin with the Millian perspective. So I wonder if you could each analyze Mill's argument from your respective theories of tolerance. And of course, Professor Bejan speaks about tolerance in her book, although it's mainly on civility, and of course you speak about tolerance in your book. So I wonder, what are its strengths and weaknesses of this Millian approach coming from your perspective? Is this the right approach to take when we're thinking about tolerance and free speech in the university? Or from your perspective, would you modify it in some way, this kind of a way of thinking about tolerance?
Me first?
Yes, would you want to
So, right. Middlebury. Yeah, so Cornell West, he is my dear friend. I've known him for 35 years. We have lunch together about every other week, and Robbie, George, and I have been sparring for decades. So with all due respect to both of them, no, I don't like the Millian substance of the argument at all. And in fact, my account of tolerance is quite at odds with that substance. So my account of tolerance assumes roughly a shared life of some sort, a shared collection of loves and commitments among those who give and receive tolerance. It needn't be a thick life, a robust collection of loves and commitments, but there's got to be something there. It even could be the sort of life shared between a community and a stranger they welcome. It could be that thin. But it's the goodness of the shared life and the value placed in the relationships that it sustains that justifies the appeal to endurance of difference within it. By contrast, Mill wants a defense of toleration that makes no such appeal to shared commitments or loves. An account that is, as far as I read it, entirely formal. And, on my view, entirely false. So let me explain why. The argument goes like this. Premise 1. Many of our past beliefs have turned out to be false, even beliefs that we once held with great conviction. Premise 2. It follows that some of our current beliefs, even those we hold with great conviction, will turn out to be false also. Ergo, conclusion. Let us tolerate dissenting opinions, just in case our current opinions are false and these dissenting opinions are right. That's the argument. It's an argument based on a certain account of fallibilism. I'm looking at John Rose, who knows lots about this. Fallibilism with respect to belief. An account that, and here I'm drawing on a Columbia philosopher named Akio Bilgrami, an account that I think is self-consuming. The argument goes like this. Notice how the judgment in the first premise, I'll read it again, many of our past beliefs have turned out to be false, even beliefs that we once held with great conviction. Notice how the judgment in the first premise is made from the point of view of one's current beliefs and convictions, a point of view that we currently take to be true. But the judgment in the second premise is telling us that our current point of view may contain false views, views about which we should be uncertain, perhaps even diffident. Now, if we are unsure about our current beliefs and our judgment in the first premise is made on the basis of our current beliefs, then to the extent that we must be unsure of our first and then to that extent we must be unsure of our first and most basic premise. Any conclusion based on it, therefore, is bound to be, to that extent, shaky itself and uncertain. It's a self-consuming argument, it seems to me. He wants an entirely formal account of tolerance based on the fallibility of belief. I don't think he can have it. My account is very much different. It's based on a commitment to a shared life of some sort.
Thanks. Professor Bejan.
Yeah, so it's funny. I got criticized by some reviewers and colleagues for not talking about Mill in my book, because there's a kind of, the B plot in my book is about kind of free speech, and we can talk about that more. But it's funny. I actually the reason I didn't talk about Mill is because thought Mill was not making good arguments.
It's not a good argument.
In very much the way that Professor Bowlin was just describing. But I actually, I find myself now in the position of defending Mill, because I actually don't think the argument's as weak as you portray it. And actually, I think it's a dispute about what Mill's argument actually is. I think that what actually drives the argument for Mill is this argument about the importance of disagreement, confrontation, and conflict in the development of the individual. And so it's really primarily an ethical concern with individual autonomy, and the connection of autonomy to the sort of nature of human beings as a progressive, the nature of our species as mankind is a progressive being, he says. And so I absolutely agree that what I call, in other things I've written, the theodicy of truth production, that doesn't work. And basically, you can actually read sort of my account of Roger Williams as somewhat Millian, but without the theodicy of truth production, because he's too much of a Calvinist. But that concern with what Mill calls the self-sovereignty of the individual, I think really is primary and governing. He concedes that in particular disagreements, the truth won't out. His argument about truth production is sort of in the very long run. And once he's made that kind of concession, I don't know how much weight you can actually put on it. I think what's doing the lifting in the argument is this concern with autonomy. And that, I think, actually speaks to your concern, John, about the necessity for something shared, a sort of commitment to a shared way of life. I think basically he's basing this on a sense that we live in societies that value this thing we call the individual. And insofar as we do, a condition of individuality is this sense of people living their lives from the inside and holding their views for good reasons. I mean, I think that commitment is certainly under challenge, and has been since 1858. But I am just maybe this is again always the contrarian me, but sort of I went in because all we teach at Oxford, if you're curious, all we teach at Oxford is Mill. It's all we teach. And so I went in being really grumpy about Mill, and now I'm just really grumpy about the way it seems to me my colleagues actually are misreading Mill. It's not so bad. But actually, I mean, so go back to what I don't like about Mill. I think that Mill has this sense that actually what's really important for this project to work is a willingness not to punish or shame people for holding views we take to be wrong, but to communicate to them and discourse with them about the fact that their views are wrong and why they are wrong, right? So there really is a kind of evangelical impulse in Mill. And I think he's aware of it. What we're meant to be doing is arguing and trying to save the souls of our fellow automatons. But because he's not an actual evangelical and because he has the theodicy of truth production, I think that commitment is basically ungrounded in his thought. And so again, I sort of just prefer to go to the source and consult some actual evangelicals.
Okay, good. Maybe one final question for you both, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. And this came up actually at dinner. We were out with a bunch of students from my class over dinner, and we were chatting, and this article came up. Professor Bejan was there. She spoke to my class. We went out to dinner afterwards at Bon Rouge, and we had a great dinner, and we talked about politics, which you're not supposed to do over dinner, but, in civil company, but we did, and it was a lot of fun. But one of the things that we talked about was an article in the Atlantic that was published maybe 2 weeks ago on the online edition, and the title was called "The Geography of Partisan Prejudice." And so they have a map. They try to map the most and least politically open-minded counties in America. So you can go to this and actually check it out and see how your county is doing. I'll tell you how Durham is doing in a second. But okay, so how did you do this map? Okay, so they hired out a company to map this, and they would go and they would ask people, how would you feel if a close family member married a Republican or a Democrat? How well do you think the terms selfish, compassionate, or patriotic tend to describe Democrats or Republicans? And they found in a study that the most politically intolerant Americans tended to be whiter, more highly educated, older, urban, and more partisan themselves. And particularly those people who went to graduate school, they found were the most intolerant because they had the least amount of political disagreement in their lives. As a result, they said they don't routinely talk to people from different political perspectives. So in case you're wondering, according to their map, the most politically intolerant county in the country is Suffolk County in Massachusetts, which is where Boston is. I think they had a 100% on the intolerance, the political intolerance scale.
That's pretty awesome.
We're much better here in Durham County. We're 58th. We have a 58%. But that ties us actually the second most intolerant politically in North Carolina. So my question, I think for you is, what do we make of this? How do we move forward? If you're worried about political tolerance, if you're worried about getting on together, if you're worried about sort of peaceful coexistence and you think that's something that we should strive for, and of course the finger is sort of pointed at the people like us that have postgraduate degrees, so the finger's sort of pointed at us. How do we respond? You've both thought quite a lot about civility and tolerance. What would you advise us to do next in response to this study? Teresa will give you the first word. And John will give you the last word.
So this is something that I think a lot about, and I do have some thoughts. I don't like to be overly prescriptive because I think that really what I learned from studying civility was that a crucial kind of accompanying virtue for civility is a kind of not a commitment to fallibilism, but a kind of epistemic humility. So in that spirit, I just, in terms of just first to remark on the trend, I think that on the one hand, you hear that, the best educated people are the least tolerant, and so, that sounds surprising. But actually, it's not that surprising because often the best educated people tend to be the wealthiest. And if you can pay to avoid the disagreeableness of actually encountering people you disagree with, you will. And so the kind of self-selection into geographic enclaves that are sort of sorting politically isn't surprising because those who have the funds to do that will actually choose that as being a kind of, thing that they will go along with all the other goods and securities that they are seeking. But so that's a function, if you will, of the free market. But that isn't then to say that it's a good thing. And here, sometimes I worry that this is just a product of navel gazing, but then I think again, well, I'm a proud navel gazer. My navel's very interesting, which is to say, I do think universities have an important role to play insofar as they do and have long functioned as basically de facto credentialing institutions for elites. I think it's possible to think about the role of the university in kind of shaping the culture, shaping the aspiration, shaping the kind of experience of disagreement. It's my favorite thing to quote, but Hobbes comes off poorly in my book because he offers a civility that's basically a kind of civil silence, just never actually saying, you can differ, but please don't disagree. But actually, I think Hobbes comes to this conclusion because he's actually really good on understanding the dynamic of disagreement. Hobbes shows us that, disagreement simply is disagreeable. There's a reason that disagreeable is a synonym for unpleasant. It's the fact that when we disagree with someone, we understand other minds on the model of our own. And so we actually have a kind of shock when we encounter someone who's come to a different conclusion, especially on the things that we consider to be most important, most fundamental, those most closely tied to our identities. And so we have to kind of make sense then of that disagreement. Some of the causes we look for, that person is stupid. They're evil. They're insane. They're self-interested. There must be they must have some interest in believing this way. And so Hobbes says, the problem with disagreement is if you disagree with a man on one thing, you've accused him of reasoning incorrectly, at best. If you disagree with him on a number of points, it's tantamount to calling him a fool. So disagreement itself is experienced as a kind of insult. And I do think that universities have an important role to play, and I think that's where the Millian spirit is a good one in cultivating, at the best, at the least, a kind of tolerance of disagreement, a tolerance of the disagreeableness of disagreement in our students, and at best, a kind of appetite for engaging in that disagreeableness. I think universities really err when they make their sort of end or purpose to try to provide as agreeable an experience to students as possible. And I will say that I find the airport hangar with all the food in it really, really agreeable. It was great. I spent my day there. But I worry slightly when we lose this sense of actually there is this kind of tolerance we need to build up to this kind of shock to our self-understanding and our understandings of the world.
Thank you.
That sounds lovely. I want to find this hanger.
Oh, it's great. It's really great.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think these sociological facts, these political facts about our country are disturbing. There's another collection of sociological facts that says, yes, we're sorting ourselves into enclaves. There's also evidence that when people who have, I mean, maybe it's in response to the shock of disagreement, when you actually put people in close proximity to each other who have different points of view, that in fact it's not peace that comes but violence.
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of the Bosnian story, right? Look, the forces that are sorting us in this way into economic and ideological enclaves are pretty powerful right now. It's not exactly clear how we can resist them. I'm all in favor of institutions like institutions of higher learning, like universities and colleges, opposing those forces, right? Cultivating certain habits among the young people, I think that's excellent. But I think we've got to look for additional sites besides universities because these are elite places. Mm-hmm. So I teach at a theological seminary, and it's a mainline one. Mainline churches are 91% white. And more, I teach at a Presbyterian seminary, more and more the Presbyterian church is a collection of tall steeple churches in big towns that are pretty wealthy, and then dying congregations in smaller towns. And the lights are only on because they've got endowments or something. So that means the Presbyterian church is going to be urban, well-educated, wealthy, and white, which is a prescription for this disaster we're talking about. What's then a possible other site? So I'm criticizing my own church for being a mess and awful, and I don't know really why I'm still there. There are churches that, in fact, get this right. Catholic churches. Most Catholic parishes are multi-ethnic, multiracial, and have an economic gradient that's huge. That it just doesn't exist in Presbyterian churches or Episcopalian churches. The same is true of Pentecostals. The same is true of Islam, of Muslim mosques in North America and Canada. So we have religious sites that are different from universities, where in fact people of all kinds are actually bumping into each other, worshiping together, and don't think that because you worship at one place that there's agreement on basic matters. There isn't. There's no evidence of that. In fact, the sociological and anthropological data is just the opposite, right? So all that Clifford Geertzian story about religious communities living under a collection of shared symbols is false to the degree to which different subgroups and individuals within a religious community are actually applying and interpreting a common set of symbols in vastly different ways. So even in religious communities that we think are have a certain homogeneity about them, in fact, they don't. So long as they've got kind of racial, ethnic, and economic diversity in the religious traditions in North America that I just described, Pentecostalism, Islam, and Catholicism. So another site.
Yeah, thanks. Well, let's end on agreement that may conceal disagreement. Thank you.